welcome our panel members on the today's session that is dedicated to the UN Sustainable Goals and innovations, how practice and academia can work together in order to answer to the call of UN objectives. First, please allow me to introduce our panelists. My name is Iana Shaheen. I will be today moderator. I'm an assistant professor at University of Arkansas. Please allow me to welcome Mr. Keith Adams, who is a community developer with a focus on disaster resilience. Keith serves as an executive director of New Jersey volunteer organizations active in disasters, VOAD, and the vice chair of the board of direction National Volunteer Organizations active in disasters. Keith, thank you so much for joining us. Then please allow me to welcome Dr. Erica Gralla, who is a professor at George Washington University. She studies operations, supply chain management in disaster response and other urgent and uncertain environment. Her record of publication is thriving, and her research seeks to combine the strengths of human intuition and mathematical modeling to create better decision-making approaches, specifically during disaster relief. Erica, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, Kathy Fulton won't be joining us. She apologized, and also she provided us with some really valuable notes that I will do my best to incorporate during discussion. The last but not the least, Dr. Arash Azadegan from Rutgers University. He is a professor and the director of Supply Chain Disruption Research Laboratory. Dr. Azadegan has over a decade of industrial experience with Fortune 100 companies such as Quaker and Ford Motor, and right now his research focuses on supply chain disruptions as well as humanitarian and disaster relief. Thank you, Arash, so much for joining us, and thank you, the panelists, for joining us. So now I hope that we can jump right into the session and start having a discussion. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to send it to the chat area. I will try to incorporate it to the discussion right away, so it's as lively as possible. And let me know if you have any questions. It is very important to innovate during the times like now. And United Nations spend a lot of time on concentrating on developing those innovations to answer the call of having a more sustainable world. So in order to start this discussion, I was wondering if Keith would be so kind to share what types of innovation are common at VOAD organizations, and how do you guys innovate?
Thanks for putting me out first, but I'll try my best. So in the VOAD world, traditionally, we were very much focused in two parts of the disaster cycle, and that was response to disasters and then recovery from. But there's two other parts to that disaster cycle. One is preparedness and also mitigation. And each state, we're part of a national organization that represents, you may not be familiar with our name, but you certainly know our partners. Ranging from folks like the American Red Cross and Salvation Army, Team Rubicon, Islamic Relief, and over 100 others that are working every day. You know, and we use sustainability thinking when we're looking at the UN goals. But I like to say that the kind of correlation to that in the VOAD world is a thing we call resilience. And of course, resilience, you know, we hear this word kicked around a lot today. But we are specifically focused on community resilience, because what we know is that resilient communities not only respond better in times of disaster, but also recover quickly or more quickly than communities that don't. And so at the very basis, and this is why, and thank you for introducing me as a community developer with a focus on disaster, our organization is very focused on making relationships right down to the very local level. And how we do this is not only looking at disasters as those kind of big regional things, like right now we have Hurricane Zeta that's impacting Louisiana. But I've also been very active here in our region with Hurricane Sandy, which we're still recovering from, by the way. But those regional disasters are normally what we were focused on and saw. But what we were actually see in this is that there's a lot of kind of smaller disasters. So large disasters actually happen in a context of a community. So what do we mean by that? So if there's homelessness in your community, if you have a disaster that affects the whole community, you have more homelessness. If you have food insecurity in your community, that becomes greater. If you have an unemployment problem, if you have addiction problems, if you have the whole realm of community problems become worse in a disaster. So we felt it was really important to start working on a very local level because this is where disasters obviously start and end, to build networks of individuals who are responding to these kind of everyday individual and household disasters, which then allows us to leverage those relationships when we actually have a widespread or regional disaster. In COVID, we especially see where these local relationships really pay off. So when we talk about innovation in our community, oftentimes it is a result of something that occurs. So the disaster becomes the impetus, and often we're innovating kind of on the fly, trying to leverage these relationships into new and agile solutions that the particular disaster calls for. So I'll give you an example. We also partner with the New Jersey state government and also FEMA in our work. And our approach has typically been kind of top-down respond to give you an example, in Hurricane Sandy, we had something like 360,000 households in New Jersey that were affected, but mainly in our coastal regions, which meant that the inland regions, we were able to move resources. So those of us that quote unquote were not affected could go help those who were, both in terms of volunteers and other resources. COVID put that kind of on its head because we have 9 million residents throughout all of our 21 counties who are affected in some way by the spread of COVID-19. So this required a very much different response because when you're all potential survivors of the disaster, that changes the thinking, especially when it comes to kind of last mile delivery, of those services. So as an example, our food banks, and I'll just pick out one, the Community Food Bank of New Jersey, which has a large facility in Hillside. They typically had about 200 volunteers a week that were helping them package food for delivery throughout their service area. And very early on, it was realized is that we can't do this. It's a huge warehouse facility, but there was no way that maintaining proper social distance and the PPE required and so on and so forth, not to mention the fact that most of their volunteers were in what was initially that kind of identified age group of which I belong to be particularly vulnerable to COVID. So we work with them actually to take their staff. They have about 60 full-time employees that work there. They put them on a 24-hour round-the-clock schedule. And then we supplemented them with about 10 to 20 volunteers from some of our organizations who went in there and actually worked a shift. So the reality is that they're operating at about 1/3 over what their capacity normally is or demand, but they had to change things a little bit. So that's an example of innovation. But I would again go back to is that kind of the mother of innovation certainly is the circumstance. But unless you have those strong relationships between organizations, volunteers, the wherewithal, so even if you're thinking out of the box, if you don't know where the resources are, it's hard to put that together in the face of something that is affecting your community as a traumatic event. That's why it's important to work on these relationships and know each other's capabilities and know how groups can work together for the benefit of their community. And again, it's an extension of neighbor taking care of neighbor, organizations taking care of neighboring organizations, and ultimately the whole community. So
thank you so much for this amazing, introduction, especially for most of us who are not working on the front line to the disaster response. This was very interesting and very insightful. I just want to kind of resonate in a couple of points and add from what Kathy wanted to share specifically, you mentioned the importance of the last mile delivery, and she also said that her organization is at the forefront of disaster response, and saying that the last mile delivery for COVID vaccine is challenging right now. She was saying that due to the lack of cold storage and some software technologies, innovation on those fronts is really needed. Another interesting point that you raised, and it kind of moves us slowly toward our next discussion point, is the notion of the resource scarcity, and how it does, and that is the fact that it does indeed affect the innovation development. And I want to start with Erica, and please feel free to resonate on whatever Keith said, or if there is anything that you want to start with, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, great. So I want to just give a little bit of background about where my answers are coming from. So I've done work both domestically and internationally, but I'm more familiar with international disaster response, so the sort of humanitarian aid community, and the kinds of innovation that they're thinking about. So some of the examples of innovation in, let's say, humanitarian supply chains, so the way that goods are ordered and moved and provided to the beneficiaries. I think that the humanitarian community would point to, in particular, the use of cash and vouchers. So the idea of, rather than giving a sack of rice, giving cash so that the beneficiary can buy a sack of rice in the market. So that has the added benefit of being easier to transport and also rejuvenating local markets. So I think that the sort of humanitarian community writ large would point to that as an example of the development of innovation in humanitarian aid and in humanitarian supply chains in particular. Another example of innovation in those kinds of supply chains is the rollout of better data collection and information systems, which doesn't sound like it ought to be called an innovation because we've known how to do that for decades, but it's not that straightforward. As anyone who's done this will tell you. And particularly it's made harder by resource scarcity and by some other constraints, right? So if you're Walmart, you have a certain amount of money available to you, and you have a sort of clarity and stability in what your supply chain looks like. Right? You know where your stores are and where you're delivering them to, and that makes it easier to roll out a tracking system, for example. But if you're a humanitarian aid provider, you are often dealing with something brand new that couldn't have been predicted before. So you don't know where you're providing aid. You don't have control over, well, you have control over it once it happens, but you don't know where that's going to be. And your supply chain is always changing with the nature of the next emergency response. And so that uncertainty makes it much harder to roll out an information system that depends on understanding the sort of scope and where those points of information collection and information distribution are going to be. The resource scarcity, so I wanted to give those examples to set the stage. Then some very general points on how resource scarcity affects the ability to do this kind of innovation. Many humanitarian agencies internationally, and probably domestically as well, I suspect Keith could speak to this, but a lot of international organizations live grant to grant. So they depend on donor funding, and they depend on funding from small donors, but also from these sort of large institutional donors. And a lot of the time, if the donor is not interested in innovation, if the donor is interested in making sure that the aid is given to this particular beneficiary, or that it's not being spent on, administrative overhead, that administrative overhead could be what funds innovation, right? So if I invite all of you to think about the last time you gave money to a humanitarian organization on a website, and there's a little box that says, do you want your donation to be earmarked for the COVID response? Or do you want it to be earmarked for Hurricane Sandy? Or do you want it to be earmarked for the earthquake in Nepal? Or do you want to give it to the organization as a whole? You probably picked one of those things. I want my donation to be used to give aid to people. And sometimes because of that, I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. In many cases, that's the right thing to do. But because of that, there's very little sort of resources at or humanitarian organizations to spend on innovation and coming up with new ideas. If you just have enough money, just barely, to serve the people you want to serve, you're going to use that money to serve as many people as possible, not to experiment with new supply chain management approaches. And so that's, you know, one of the challenges in which resource scarcity and the particular way in which resources are provided in this context makes it really challenging. On the other hand, of course, there are grants out there for innovation specifically, and I think that's one of the ways in which the humanitarian community has been able to come up with some of these really clever ideas that I talked about before, or think about 3D printing or the use of drones, or all these sort of wild ideas out there. So resource scarcity makes it hard to find the time and space to do innovation when you're really focused on using those resources and maximizing their use to fill the mission, even though that resource scarcity makes it almost more important to do innovation as well. I'll stop there.
Well, Erica, thank you so much. It was really insightful. And not to take a lot of time from the discussion, I would jump right to Arash and just ask if there is any of the points you want to add on, or is there a completely different point of view on the resource scarcity and innovation development?
Yeah, this is great. I hope you can hear me. But I think Erica and Keith really set the stage and offered great insights. Looking at it slightly different and perhaps just to offer anecdotal evidence, right? Not generalizable, but you know, innovation and creating new things is never generalizable. Otherwise, everybody would do it, and it wouldn't be a new thing. But you know, so first of all, what type of innovation are we looking at? We're looking at innovations within an organization that would be process related for improving efficiencies, or innovations that help with the outcome, which we call product innovation. So that those are the two type of process and product innovations that we are looking at. Fascinatingly enough, going back to what Keith was saying, is you know, the need to innovate and come up with different ways particularly shows its head when I have to do so, when there's a necessity, right? And in fact, the common saying, or the famous saying, necessity is the mother of all inventions, comes to mind. And so I'm sure Keith would echo this, that, you know, when you're at a bind, your back is by the wall, so to speak, you're going to come up with MacGyver style stuff that would respond to. But, you know, as I was preparing for this panel, I also came across another quote that is not heard of as much, and that is, if necessity is the mother of all inventions, laziness is the father of all inventions. and the reason I bring that up is because, you know, there are ways when you just don't want to. I mean, I'm sure the guy that came up with the remote control for the TV thought about, gee, what if I was able to change the channel without having to get off of my couch, type of a thing, right? And so that's a silly example, but it kind of makes the point. And and where laziness comes from is when there isn't resource scarcity. And of course, obviously necessity is when there is resource scarcity. And in both circumstances, there could be possibilities for innovation. And what we're finding out now, Iana and I both are working on this study that looks at the effects of COVID on innovation within food banks. And fascinatingly enough, in both of the circumstances, you do see innovations, but they're very different in many regards. The form of innovation is different. During COVID, and I would echo exactly what Keith said, is you're just doing the stuff that you have to do to essentially survive and do the best you can at the moment. Going back to what Erica was saying, perhaps during more blue skies, the innovation is what the United Nations is expecting for in terms of long-term sustainability. And the latter is what we're missing quite a bit on, is this ability to look in the long run. And Erica is absolutely right with regards to short-term grants and the contractual nature of how much of the agreements are made at the global level with many of the NGOs. And of course, they don't know necessarily how much their funding is going to be. So that short-term funding and availability of resources means that, you know, broader, bigger, sustainable innovations become much more difficult to think through.
Thank you so much, Arash, for such an good summary and kind of incorporating all the points together. While we're moving to the next question, I just want to quickly to go back to what Keith was saying. And we talked about resource scarcity in terms of different types of innovation, in terms of financial scarcity. But in the beginning, Keith also mentioned that the scarcity of social capital and human scarcity of employees might be an issue. So I was wondering if Keith, you actually have encountered something like this in your work, and if it also, and how do you innovate in that regards?
Sure. So, you know, as a nonprofit leader, and I'm just going to point out, and I'll just go back to Arash, your comment about scarcity driving, and of course this goes back to Erica's comments as well. So it is scarcity driving, but it's scarcity and laziness, but it's and, right? It's not or. So what happens is we kind of work in this. Again, you know, we have disasters, and the bigger media attention they get, the more donors that we have that feel compelled to reach in their pockets and give something. I do think that we've made tremendous progress on having people understand that cash is best, both in terms of helping the local economy, but also giving some self-determination. In our work that we used to, when I started, because I'm ancient, we used to call people disaster victims. Now we call them disaster survivors, because it connotates kind of a different way of looking at things and involving them and directing their own recovery. But again, one of the losses has been is this, when we look at this kind of work, and one of the barriers to innovations has been is that, you know, when I'll give you an example, in this point, after Superstorm Sandy here in the New York region, we were working somewhere on the neighborhood of nearly $20 billion in government allocation at this point towards recovery. And we also had probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $13 to $14 million in nonprofit resources that were available. And in COVID, we're not, you know, we don't even have a tenth of that, even though we really are facing some of the very same problems in terms of meeting social services. And of course, the nonprofits themselves are affected by COVID as well. So this kind of idea that, first of all, that there's always going to be this big resource that's going to drive innovation and drive new programs is not always there. And of course, it's not consistent. One of the things that has been great in COVID-19 is I've been working with New Jersey grantmakers, Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and other partners to start talking about how we build disaster funding, funding for innovation in this within the normal kind of grant cycle, within the normal book, if you will, of the philanthropic community. And a big challenge behind this is not only getting the community foundations and corporate partners and others who are involved in this community to realize the necessity for two things. One, and that is that actually funding the nonprofits that are doing the job out in the street. The organizations have to exist in order to support that mission or that donor intent of taking care of people that were affected by X, Y, or Z. And the second thing is that this just isn't something that stands up when a particular disaster occurs, right? These relationships, this work has to be ongoing throughout all phases. So we're talking about working in preparedness and mitigation and other things that typically have not been well supported by donors. So part of this is educating donors and educating people to understand that this is worthwhile work. We often say that $1 in preparedness, okay, can often save up to $7 in actual response expenses or recovery expenses. So there is value in this, and this is an important way also, I think, that the academic community plays a role. Certainly here in New Jersey, we've been very blessed with being able to partner with the academic community. But one of the challenges that we have had, it's not laziness, it's capacity, and also this idea of competition within the nonprofit sector, and that is getting good data to support our kind of ask of donors to support us in blue skies and gray. So those are some of the challenges that we've seen.
Very interesting, and we have a very insightful questions in the chat area, and I want to bring it up to the discussion. And thank you so much for using the chat area. If you have any questions, feel free to send it to us at any time. Joel is in particular asking if scaredness is the root of scarcity, and how does fear affect innovation? And I think that is a really interesting topic, especially whether fear has an accelerating or paralyzing effect. And I was wondering whether Erica or Arash would like to take a first shot at answering the question.
I'll say something brief, and then I suspect Arash has more to say than I do. But that is a very interesting way of putting the question. And I'm just going to guess, right? I'm an academic. I'm not in one of these organizations. But I think going back to the kind of picture I painted for you earlier, certainly an organization does not want to be seen as experimenting with new processes or new services when it might undermine the delivery of essential services to survivors of disasters, right? And so there is definitely a certain amount of fear about innovating when there is a real need. So in what we would call, the non-blue sky situation, right? When there's actually a disaster ongoing, and this would potentially take away resources from that. So I can see it having a more paralyzing effect. On the other hand, the situation that Keith described earlier was the sort of the opposite. If you can't perform your mission, then you have to innovate. And so the fear of not being able to perform a mission could have an accelerating effect. So I don't think it's as simple as one or the other. It is either, it can be one or the other, or potentially even both, depending on the circumstances. And I think the question for all of us is to think about, how do we make sure that when it's useful and productive, it's accelerating, and when it's not, right? This is sort of the heart of innovation research. But I don't think we have the answer yet, but maybe Arash has the answer.
I don't know if I have the answer. Thank you, Erica. That was pretty insightful and actually triggered some thoughts in my mind. Perhaps we need to really differentiate, the thought of Mars versus Venus comes to mind, is that the humanitarian space is very different than for-profit or commercial. And of course, we're in business school, and so we consider innovation as it happens with companies like Intel. And I mentioned that for a reason, because there is a book by Andy Grove, the founder of Intel. The title of his book, right, Joel, is Only the Paranoid Survive, right? So this notion of fright actually triggers some willingness to take risk. Is that risk transferable to the humanitarian arena, and should we actually mention that or bring that up in our education to the students? What I'm afraid of is what Erica exactly said. Are humanitarian organizations such as New Jersey VOAD more concerned about being attacked because of using the funds that they're provided to inappropriately for something that doesn't directly affect the beneficiaries right away, or the victims, or are they more scared of being thought of as someone that is not ahead of the game or proactive? There is no such thing as significant competition, dare I say, and I'm probably wrong on this, that would create survival reasons for many of the humanitarian organizations as opposed to for-profits, right? Google was just created 20 years ago, right? And prior to that, I mean, do you guys remember, there was many different search engines, they went away just because of competition. That that level of competition, although there is competition in the humanitarian space, is not necessarily on a survival level, or perhaps another way of putting it, that survival is not necessarily hinging on being able to come up with new processes or new products. So yes, so in summary, being scared, I don't think being scared, I think humanitarian organizations are more scared about being attacked on, gee, you could have saved 150 people, but you only saved 120 because you were tinkering with a new idea.
But I think if I could just jump in for a second, Iana. So I think that there is more direct correlation, and think about the kind of capital risk that you're talking about is reputational risk. So I do think that nonprofits are very concerned about reputational risk, and there is huge competition. So huge competition isn't direct to a consumer market, like in a for-profit world. The competition amongst nonprofits is often on trying to, kind of compete for that limited dollar. So for New Jersey VOAD and National VOAD and organizations that are umbrellas, we certainly are trying to work to take competition out of that and provide a unified, our message to our members every day is that we get further together, that we are able to more effectively use those resources when we collaborate. But I would think that the average nonprofit is looking at foundation dollars, corporate donors, individual donors, very much in a competitive way. So they want to be perceived as, again, that they're good stewards of that donor dollar. And the reputation of that organization is key to the ability to continue to raise funds. So yes, it's about being effective in whatever their mission is, but then how they translate that message back. So, sometimes that drives innovation. It drives folks to want to be kind of on the cutting edge of things. But then I also think that there is a bit of fear that holds people back and say, well, what if that turns out? Where is the space? Where is the grace, if you will, to where you tried something and it went horribly wrong? And some of our very large NGOs have tried to innovate in ways, in situations that did not go very well, got a lot of media attention, and actually did harm their bottom line in a significant way here in the last 10 years. So I think it's a little both. But the same kind of things that drive for-profits, to a certain extent, drive nonprofits as well.
Thank you, Arash, Keith, and Erica for providing the perspective on the question. And I do agree with you. It's kind of both, and it's really, as everything, situational dependent. Another interesting comment in the chat area is about the volunteering versus value. And specifically, William was saying, and it's very common in the for-profit world, that the more you invest, the more you get a return. And basically, he was wondering if that is the same way in the humanitarian. And then he just wrote that a common conference trend is the need to change mindsets about capitalism. And Keith, you were saying that there is resource scarcity, and Erica mentioned that there is financial constraints. And he was just wondering whether financial resources are man-made and can be expanded limitlessly. And then he mentioned that human capital and natural capital are more limited. I know that this is a broader comment, and that's why I don't want to call any one of you. So if someone wants to start.
Well, I think he's right in saying that. Is I don't think that, as always, when we talk about all social, all the social ills, or if you will, or situations in the country, in the United States, especially, it is not a lack of financial resources. It's about where people choose to put those financial resources. So that's either the government, or it is individual donors, or all the folks in between. So it is about choices. So I don't mean to imply that there's not sufficient capital, but sometimes we are not putting that capital in the place that actually drives the most societal change. And that's something that, again, that comes from decisions both on an individual level and then also collectively with corporate foundation and government.
Yes, Arash.
You know, this is a fascinating comment. Thank you, Mr. Russell, for bringing it up. I was just last night, I was watching a movie, and the guy was his doctor told him that he has ALS, and he turned around and he said, "Oh, the ice bucket disease," right? And you know, it just triggered in my mind that you know, people associate the disease to a funding or funding campaign as a result of that. So you're absolutely right. And you know, the ice bucket campaign brought a huge amount of funding in that regard. So you're right that you know, financial resources, especially in today's world, is almost limitless because you know, central bank can print money as much as they want to. Dare I suggest that it's the human attention that is limited, right? We can only focus on so many things. And I hope Keith and Erica would echo this. We know that a week or so after an event, be it Hurricane Zeta or, you know, Hurricane Sandy or whatever else, the amount of funding that goes into it significantly raises. But unfortunately, it's about a month or so later that much more need is provided and people forget. And so I think if there is a resource scarcity, perhaps it's the mindset and the memory available to all of us to be able to focus on so many different things, right? There has been so many issues that have happened that unfortunately were tucked under the rug by news media, etc., simply because we were overwhelmed with issues of COVID. But other factors, other unfortunate events are happening around the world that are just not getting the attention, and as a result, the resources as well.
Arash, thank you so much for adding to the comments. And just quickly, I was wondering if Erica has anything to add so that I kind of just to sum it up. If not, please feel free to just move to the next discussion point.
Not much. I want to just sort of frame what I heard said already, which is I think it's a question of matching where and when the funding is available, right? So it needs to be there for this purpose and at the right time. And I think that's a lot of the challenge. But I suspect this comment is a much broader one. And this the one that just showed up also. And these are things that sort of these really large questions about economics is not something that I feel qualified to comment on, but I think it's a really good way of thinking about whether we can solve some of these nitty-gritty operational innovation problems that we've been talking about with some big ideas around financing. So great to have this discussion, but I don't have much to add beyond that.
Would you like to just move to one of our last discussion points, and basically just summing up is how do we measure the impact and innovation strategy on sustainable goals?
Who would you like to start that one, Iana?
Oh, I was just, please go ahead. I was just waiting for you to continue, sorry.
So I have thought about this. I knew this question was coming and I still don't have a great answer, right? So my answer is we know a lot about how measurement matters for being able to achieve something. So if you aren't measuring something and you aren't held accountable for that something, then it's hard to get anyone to achieve it, right? So I think it's crucial. It goes without saying, it's crucial to measure the impact of innovation on anything, right? And then the key part of this question is actually this question of sustainability. So we've talked a lot in this panel so far about innovation, we haven't talked that much about sustainability yet, right? So we've talked about innovation for whatever reason. It could be to make it faster to reach the people who need it. It could be to reach them with something more appropriate or that provides greater dignity and self-direction, right? There are lots of reasons that could matter. And I think that, so let me say the basic thing, right? We know from decades of experience and management study and all of this, that if you measure something, you're more likely to achieve it. And so there's a lot of work out there that says about how to come up with a small set of key performance indicators that can help you choose. So I'm not going to dwell on that. I think the challenge here is that we don't have that for sustainability, and not all organizations are actually measuring sustainability as one of their handful of key performance indicators. In addition, it's hard to measure innovation, right? So that's a second thing that I suspect someone else someone else on the panel will talk about. But it's really, really hard to measure innovation because in sort of by definition, if you're setting aside some resources for innovation, you don't know what you're going to come up with. So it's hard to say, well, how's your progress toward that thing that you're going to build? Well, what thing? I don't know what it is yet. So I can't tell you how close I am to getting there. And so that makes it just very, very hard to measure innovation. To measure sustainability is almost is another really big challenge. And so I think that I'm going to go back to the very, very basics and say, a very simple approach to measuring the impact of innovation on sustainability is to define a key performance indicator, one or several for sustainability. The simpler, the better. If we try to encompass everything, in my experience, we end up nowhere and nobody's able to measure it. So we might just have to pick one dimension of sustainability and say, this is what we're going to do first. And if we have some way of holding people accountable to it. And again, I'm focused here at the operational level. And so if we had a very operational definition of sustainability, I'm seeing in the comments that folks are mentioning these kinds of things, like this is fuzzy, it can be fuzzy. So let's come up with something that isn't fuzzy. And then I think it has to be the donors actually, who say, if you're going to take my money, then you're going to measure the usual things like how many people you've helped, but you're also going to measure this feature of sustainability so that they can then kind of move the system as a whole in that direction and provide this requirement of accountability on that measure to those who are implementing it. Now, there are so many problems with that will make many people very angry. And so it has to be done very, very carefully. But I think the initiative in the current system has to kind of come from the top. I'll stop there.
Iana, is there a way for me to share the screen?
Yeah.
I just want to show something possibly.
Can you share now?
Yes.
Yes, you should be able to share your screen. There you go, Arash.
Okay, there we go. I just wanted to strongly echo what Erica was saying. Keith, of course, is at the ground level, right? I know he's very much hands-on. I teach supply chain, right? Erica is also teaching similar courses at the ground level, operational level. And perhaps, this is just an observation, but I have to bring it up. These are the objectives. This is number 2, zero hunger objective for UN sustainability goals. But let's go through some of these, the targets. Universal access to safe and nutritious food by 2030. End all forms of malnutrition by 2030. Double the productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers by 2030. When I teach my courses in terms of education for the MBA classes, where we start, and I teach supply chain and supply management, we start with corporate strategy, and we say that corporate strategy has to be brought down to business unit level strategy, and then it drops down to functional level strategies. And dare I say that the United Nations has done a wonderful job of the broad corporate strategy, multinational corporate strategy, but the rest of us are perhaps lost in how to get these things and bring them down to a level. What are we going to do between 2020 and 2030 to, if this is even possible, to safe and nutritious food? And I'll stop. And I did not say that. These are, aiming for the moon type of objectives. Let's assume that they are realistic and someone has really thought through them. But not to put Keith on the spot, but Keith, someone at the ground level, how do they get these targets and move them into a more operationalizable form of objectives?
So Arash, I think and again, it's an and, right? So to go back to Erica's talking about, and let me preface this by saying that as somebody who's written a whole lot of KPIs and been focused on metrics a lot, I can tell you how many volunteers that we employed doing Sandy. I can tell you what their impact was, both in terms of dollars and the number of houses that they worked on and so on and so forth, and the households served, and the amount of direct dollars that were spent versus administrative dollars. So we've been very focused on those metrics. But you know what? Metrics don't move donors. Fuzzy moves donors. And for us, that's essential. So one of the things that we have been kind of, I'm not throwing metrics out. We still have to have them. But part of this is storytelling. And when I say storytelling, I don't mean making up a story. What I mean is capturing the stories, capturing the impact on communities, on folks that were served, on volunteers. So again, I can tell you, that I used a volunteer, that he or she put in this many hours, that according to national labor standards, that the value of that work is X dollars. What it's hard to tell you when metrics or a KPI is that how was that volunteer transformed? How was their mindset? So we go again back to the sustainability mindset or thinking behind the UN goals. It's hard to measure how that affects the community, the household, the person who was helped. These are all kind of intangibles that I think that we have a difficult time capturing. We certainly could do a better job of capturing data metrics, although I will say that one of the barriers, again, is the competition between nonprofits. Oftentimes in Sandy, for instance, there were 14 different long-term recovery groups that operated throughout the state, assisting households. They saw each other not as co-collaborative. They saw each other as competition for a particular dollar. We have worked very hard both with the funding community, philanthropic community, and also our organizations to set up structures that will eliminate that going forward in large-scale natural disasters here in New Jersey. But it's hard to put value on that work. And that's what we struggle with every day. So my hope is that we take metrics, but then we're also able to express kind of that human fuzziness, how we're changing, not to use an overused phrase, but how are we changing hearts and minds?
Interesting, and kind of relates to what we were talking about. There is an interesting discussion on chat going on about short-term profits versus long-term sustainable goals. So I was wondering if, and just another interesting comment came up, and that probably relates to what Keith was saying, is measurement becomes a story, meaning that probably do you actually tell a story of how do you measure things? And again, I don't want to call any of you, so just feel free to jump in.
So I think Keith's point was really important. And in my experience with this, working with organizations, it's both. You need the numbers and you also need the stories. Because without the numbers, a story is just a single story. And so it's hard to know if that's widespread. But if you have the numbers to show that something is widespread or is generally true or isn't, if that's the point you're trying to make, and then you have a story that gives it the context and the appeal to donors, then you have the two components. And so the question is, what does that look like in innovation for sustainability? And how do you use that also as, like, measuring it is one thing, but incentivizing it is another. So how do you use that to create the motivation to innovate for sustainability in the face of all the constraints that we've talked about, the funding constraints. I agree with the discussion in chat that it's aligning timeframes is complicated because donors are talking short term or 5 years max in development. And 5 years is not usually enough to do an innovation, roll it out to the world and measure its impact. And so we're sort of stuck in a tricky spot for this. So I don't have a solution, but I think framing the problem is a good step towards that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of realization, especially in the philanthropic community that I've been working with around this. So I'm not going to go out on the limb and say that we've changed the way that donors, individual donors, think about this. But we certainly have changed the way decision makers in foundations and corporate finance are starting to view this. So I do think it's a matter, kind of each incident, building the relationship over time, which I think is really important for nonprofits to be working with corporate partners, to be working with government partners, to start having these kind of mutual understandings. And then again, kind of the donors, the public, if you will, kind of hearing that same story, seeing those same kind of metrics coming out from all of those groups to inform their decisions. If it was easy, we'd be there.
Well, we are kind of slowly moving toward the end. So I think that our panelist was very good in terms of incorporating the audience comments to the discussion. And I think that was great. And as a last point, before I move toward Arash to provide some final thoughts, I was wondering that how do we can incorporate all those ideas that we just discussed into the educational materials and the educational curriculum? Do we educate students? Do we educate volunteers? Do we educate humanitarian workers? And how that can be possibly achieved? So with that thought, I want to turn over Arash, and please feel free to talk about and to resonate on the points that were made before. And I just wanted to throw that question so that we can keep it in mind.
Well, I hope we get some conclusive comments from Keith and Erica as well, because clearly there has been really good comments there. But I think, Iana, what you're asking is how do we bridge this from the actual field to the education, particularly given that there's much more interest. That the courses that I teach, anytime I talk about philanthropic works and humanitarian works, and I bring up some of the research that we're doing, the students, their eyes open up and they really want to find out more. And I think part of the incentive in setting up this session is that the younger generation of incoming perhaps provides a new perspective, and also are much more attuned with information technology, which a lot of the new ways of doing so ends up being IT applications. Not all, but quite a number of them. I realize there's also drones by UPS that are being used all over, and many other types of innovations that could be helpful. Nevertheless, I think providing examples of what has been used out there and sharing the stories, as Keith said, in the classroom is what I have been trying to do to bring attention to philanthropic and humanitarian work, and particularly related to food bank, which is what I'm focused on with Iana's work. And the same thing goes with sustainability efforts. Many young of the MBA students and undergrad students are very familiar with some of the issues that we have in terms of sustainability. Now, beyond the nonprofit, I'll mention one example in terms of fast fashion and the use of significant amount of clothing that has been used. We practically 3 times as much clothing as what we buy now as opposed to 15 years ago. And interestingly enough, that is becoming a concern with many of the students that are interested in fashion and merchandising, as an example. And so when I share the supply chain of how these clothings eventually end up being burnt, if not in incinerators here in the West, but also in African countries, that raises ideas about what to do. And I think we can do the same thing by identifying the inefficiencies in humanitarian and philanthropic efforts, by saying, look at how much waste we have in food, and what things can be done in that regard. So just simply identifying the problem and offering it in front of the students through case studies would be one way to go about this.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I think, to reiterate, we have good methods for teaching many things, including measurement and key performance indicators. What we don't have are good metrics for sustainability and a way to operationalize the sort of high-level goals down to the operational level. And I think that posing that as a challenge for creative minds to think about is a really good way to make progress on it and educate at the same time, since we don't have the answers at the moment. And connecting students with organizations that are facing this challenge will help them to see what the constraints are and why it's not an easy problem to solve. So I think all of those strategies will work well. The one other thing I wanted to mention is I'm really struck by this point that I've talked about also with others, is that it's not just a number, not just the data, but also the story that goes with it. We don't have a good way of talking about that aspect. At least I don't in my classes, and that I'm aware of. And so trying to think about how to discuss that would be a useful way forward.
So I just go back to, again, this idea of looking at communities as systems, looking at this concept that as human beings, we are kind of wired to be individuals, but we're also need to connect with other individuals to thrive and survive. And it's on that concept, and it is hard to measure, but I think it's about looking or encouraging folks to get outside of their discipline. So it would be easy to sit here as a nonprofit guy and say to you is that what you do in academia doesn't matter to me because you're in your own world, or perhaps you're sitting in the philanthropic community or a corporate community, and you think that you have different views, and you do. You bring different pieces of this equation. But for communities to thrive and survive, it has to be looked at as a whole community effort, right? So it involves, the doctor and the baker, and I'll throw another one out there, an old time, the candlestick maker, I think was a rhyme from my youth, but it is a whole community approach. And that is that how can we come together as individuals across disciplinary lines, across different motivations? Maybe our motivation is to volunteer to make the world a better place, or maybe it is to provide great value to our stockholders, or to educate the top scholars in the world. But to the extent that we focus on how we can move our communities forward together, and that everybody survives and thrives, I think that's where the emphasis needs to be.
Well, we are just a minute to the end, and I really want to thank the panelists for providing such an insightful comments and for facilitating a very productive discussion. And I also wanted to thank people from the audience for actually sending those questions that reinforce, at least I can speak for myself, reinforced me to think in terms of outside the box that I was taught and I was learned to do. So I think that a lot of points were raised and the discussion is so ongoing that unfortunately we don't have a definite answers for all, but at least I think that we can say that it's great that we are thinking about it and we are on the path toward change, and maybe one day the whole sustainability and humanitarian will be so tied and aligned together that it would actually help us to be more productive and to respond to as many crises as possible. Thank you so much, everyone, again, for participating in the panel, and we will share our contact information. So if you have any questions, just email us or add on LinkedIn. Thank you.